We have discussed events that took place in Russia and the Soviet Union during the 2 decades after the First World War, but we have left the story of Europe and European empires at the signing of the peace treaties of 1919. We turn now to the wider historical changes in the period between the two world wars. These far-reaching, destructive wars reshaped modern European and global history, but there were also influential political and economic changes during the interwar decades. In these 20 years before 1939, Europeans passed through various, sometimes overlapping, cycles of optimistic confidence, disillusionment, hope, and fear. There were a few years of superficial prosperity, abruptly followed by unparalleled economic disaster. For a time, in the 1920s, democracy and democratic reforms seemed to be advancing. Then, in the difficult economic conditions of the 1930s, dictatorship began to spread in countries that had earlier tried to move toward greater democracy. Meanwhile, during these same decades, new political and social movements in Asia were challenging the European empires and colonial economic systems that had long given the European powers their dominant position in global affairs. The Great War, the Russian Revolution, and the changing world economy all affected European relations with the peoples and cultures of Asia, where anti-colonial and nationalist campaigns attracted growing popular support. The apparent post-war triumphs of European democracy coincided with a growing opposition to European imperialism in the 1920s, and the devastating economic effects of the Great Depression affected politics, cultures, and international relations throughout the world in the 1930s. 93. The advance of democracy after 1919-1390. The first years following the war were a time of social troubles. The victors and losers alike faced serious difficulties in the economic reconversion from war to peace. Veterans demobilized from the huge armies found themselves unemployed and psychologically 791 restless. Farms and factories geared to maximum production during the war faced a sudden disappearance of markets. They produced more than could now be sold, so that the war was followed by a sharp post-war economic depression, which, however, had run its course by 1922. Basically, the economic position even of the victors was seriously damaged, for the war had disjointed the pre-1914 commercial system, in which industrial Western Europe had lived by exchange with Eastern Europe and with overseas colonies and trading partners. Gains of democracy and social democracy. The war, President Wilson had said, was fought to make the world safe for democracy. Political democracy, to be sure, now made numerous advances. The new states that emerged from the war all adopted liberal democratic principles, such as written constitutions and universal suffrage. Democracy also made advances in countries that had long sought to defend or expand democratic ideas and institutions. Great Britain, for example, dropped the last barriers to universal male suffrage in 1918. The most conspicuous innovation in many countries was the growing enfranchisement of women. We have seen how the women's suffrage movement in Great Britain achieved an important breakthrough in 1918, when women received a somewhat restricted right to vote. In 1928, the restrictions were dropped, and the vote was granted on an equal basis with men. In 1920, through an amendment to the Constitution, female suffrage became general in the United States. Women voted also in Germany and in most of the new states of Europe. In the Soviet Union, women received the vote on an equal basis with men after the revolution in 1917. In most European countries, the successors of the old pre-war socialists gained in strength, with the left wings of the old socialists generally seceding, calling themselves communists, and affiliating with each other, 1391, and with Moscow in the Communist International. The European Socialists, or Social Democrats, were preponderantly parties of peaceable or revisionist Marxism, entirely willing to pursue their political and social goals by legislative methods. Labor unions, with new self-confidence gained from their role in wartime economies, grew in membership, prestige, and importance. Social legislation that before the war would have seemed radical was now enacted in many places. An 8-hour legal working day became common, and government-sponsored insurance programs against sickness, accident, and old age were either adopted or extended, An Act of 1930 in France ensured almost 10 million workers. An air of progressive democracy pervaded Europe and the European world. The social service, or welfare state, already beginning to emerge in most European countries in the late 19th century, was becoming more firmly established. Social legislation enacted democracy. Among the states that might have been expected to continue their pre-war democratic gains in the post-war years, only Italy turned away from democracy. Italy had been a parliamentary state since 1861 and had introduced a democratic male suffrage in the elections of 1913. In 1919, the Italians held their second such elections. But Italian democracy soon abruptly ended. In 1922, an agitator named Benito Mussolini, leading a movement that he called fascism, thereby adding a new word to the world's political vocabulary, ended Italian parliamentary government and founded his fascist regime. Lenin, in his way, had already created the first single-party state. Mussolini became the first of the dictators in post-war Europe outside the Soviet Union. Fascist Italy in the 1920s was the chief exception in what seemed to be a rising tide of democracy. Mussolini 792-1392, the 19th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, which gave American women the right to vote in all elections, was part of a more general expansion of women's political rights in the Atlantic world after the First World War. This poster was published by the American League of Women Voters shortly after the amendment was approved in 1920. But its message became relevant wherever women gained their long-delayed right to vote, MPI Getty Images. The new states of Central and East Central Europe. In Central and East Central Europe, in Germany, in the territory of the former Austro-Hungarian Empire, and in the western fringe of former Tsarist Russia, new states and new governments struggled to establish themselves. The new post-war states included, besides Republican Germany, the four successor states to the Habsburg Empire: Austria, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and Yugoslavia, and the 5 states that had broken away from the Russian Empire: Poland, Finland, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. See map pp. 746-747. The other small states in eastern 1393 Europe, Romania, Bulgaria, Greece, and Albania, had already been independent before 1914. Their boundaries underwent some modification, and their governments underwent considerable reorganization after the war. Turkey, the successor to the Ottoman Empire, was also a new republic. Although many people in all countries had developed nationalist identities and aspirations, the new states in Europe, except possibly in Poland, did not emerge from a long-maturing revolutionary or republican sentiment. Only an infinitesimal number of Germans in 1914 would have voted for a republic. Even among the nationalities of Austria-Hungary in 1914, few persons would have chosen the complete breakup of the Habsburg Empire. 793. The Republicans, moderate socialists, agrarians, or nationalists who now found themselves in power had to improvise governments for which there had been little preparation. They had to contend with reactionaries, monarchists, and members of the old aristocracy. They had also to deal with communist revolutionaries, who, inspired by Lenin's success, hoped to bring about a dictatorship of the proletariat. A communist revolt broke out in Germany in 1919, but was quickly suppressed. Soviet regimes were actually set up and soon crushed in Hungary and in the German state of Bavaria. And as late as 1923, there was a communist uprising in the German state of Saxony. Weakness of republicanism. The new Central European states all embodied the principle of national self-determination, which held that each nationality should enjoy political sovereignty. One nation, one government. But people and cultures in this region had always been locally intermixed. Each of the new states therefore included minority nationalities, with the exception of a disruptive forced exchange of populations between Greece and Turkey arranged in 1923. There was no thought of the actual physical removal of alien groups. Poland and Czechoslovakia each had many disaffected 1394 Germans. In Czechoslovakia, the Slovaks resented Czech domination, and in Yugoslavia, where the Serbs were in control, Croatian and other separatist movements actively opposed the Serb domination. Self-determination. Nevertheless, despite economic and nationalist troubles, the new states and governments attempted at the outset to make themselves democratic. All the newly created states were republics except Yugoslavia, where the monarchy was under the older Serbian dynasty. Hungary started out in 1918 as a republic, but the attempt of the communist leader Bela Kun to found a Hungarian Soviet republic in 1919 brought back the counter-revolutionaries who restored the Habsburg monarchy in principle, though they were prevented by foreign pressure from restoring the king in person. Hungary emerged in 1920 as a monarchy with a perennially vacant throne under an authoritarian regency exercised by Admiral Horthy. All smaller states of Europe, including Hungary, possessed at least the machinery of democracy until the 1930s. That is, they had constitutions, parliaments, elections, and a diversity of political parties. If civil liberty was sometimes violated, the right to civil liberty was not denied. And if elections were sometimes rigged, they were at least in principle supposed to be free. Economic problems of Eastern Europe. Land reform. Eastern Europe for centuries had been an agrarian region of large landed estates. The wealthy, land-owning aristocracy had been the chief support of the Austro-Hungarian Empire and an important pillar of the old order in the Tsarist Empire and in Eastern Prussia. The mass of the rural population through all this region owned little or no property and had been free from serfdom only since the middle of the preceding century. The middle class of business and professional people was small except in Austria and Bohemia, the western portion of Czechoslovakia. In general, people in this whole region were conscious of lagging behind Western Blisten 1395 Europe, not only in industry, factories, railroads, and great cities, but also in literacy, schooling, reading habits, health, death rates, length of life, and material standards of living. The new states set out to modernize themselves, generally on the model of the Western European nations. In addition to introducing democratic and constitutional ideas, they put up protective tariffs, behind which they tried to develop factories and industries of their own. But the new national boundaries created difficulties. Where Europe had 794 6,000 miles of frontiers in 1913, it had almost 10,000 after the war, and all the increase was in Eastern Europe. Goods circulated much less easily. Protected industries in the old agricultural regions produced inefficiently and at high cost. Old and established industries in Austria, Czechoslovakia, and Western Poland, cut off by the new frontiers and new tariffs from their former markets, fell upon hard times. The working class of Vienna lived in misery. Vienna, a city of 2 million persons, formerly the capital of an empire of 50 million, was now the capital of a republic of 6 million. In Czechoslovakia, the German minority living in the Sudetenland complained that in hard times the German business people and workers, because of government policies, always suffered more than their Czech counterparts. Economically, the carving up of Eastern Europe into a dozen independent states was self-defeating. Obstacles to modernization. 1396. The peace settlements after the First World War transformed Vienna from its previous status as the capital city of a large empire into the capital of a small republic, but the city managed to sustain much of its earlier cultural vitality during the 1920s. This bustling outdoor cafe and dance suggest how the Viennese found ways to enjoy themselves in the diminished political context of the post-war Austrian state. Popper photo, Getty Images. The greatest of reforms undertaken by the new Eastern European states was the reform of land ownership. Although this reform could not solve basic economic problems in the area, it did have substantial 795 effect on the pattern of land distribution. The work of the revolutions of 1848, which, in the Habsburg lands, had liberated the peasants from legal dependency but left them landless, was now carried a step further. The example of the Russian Revolution provided a powerful stimulus, for in Russia in 1917, peasants had driven off landlords, and communists won a hearing among discontented and propertyless peasants from Finland to the Balkans. Not until 1929, it should be recalled, did the Soviet Union embark on the collectivization of agriculture. Until then, communism, 1397, appeared to favor the small individual farmer. But it may be said with equal truth that the model for agrarian reform lay in Western Europe, especially in France, the historic land of the small peasant proprietor. Land reform. Land reform worked out differently in different countries, but large estates were generally broken into smaller farms throughout the Baltic states and in much of Czechoslovakia. This transformation reflected nationalist sentiment as well as a new social policy because most of the large landowners in all of these places were German. In Romania and Yugoslavia, the breakup of large estates, though considerable, was less thorough. In Finland, Bulgaria, and Greece, the issue hardly arose because small land ownership was already common. Land reform had least success in Poland and Hungary, where the landed magnates were exceptionally strong and well-rooted. After the land reforms, political parties of small landholders became the chief democratic force within the various states on the western border of Russia. Often they inclined to socialism, especially because capitalism was associated in their minds with foreign investors and outsiders. On the other hand, the great landowners, the former aristocrats of the pre-war empires, whether already expropriated or merely threatened with expropriation, were confirmed in a reactionary outlook. Although the land reforms provoked political fears among traditional social elites, the changes in land ownership did not destroy the social and economic hierarchies in Eastern European societies. The new landowners' farms were small, frequently no more than 10 acres. The peasant owners lacked capital, agricultural skill, and knowledge of the market. Farm productivity did not rise. In place of old differences between landlord and tenant, there developed new differences between the more comfortable peasants and the proletarian hired hands. The continuance of relative poverty, the obstinacy of reactionary upper classes, the new economic tensions among 1398 the peasants themselves, the economic distortions produced by numerous tariff walls, and the lack of any sustained tradition of self-government all helped to frustrate the democratic experiments launched in the 1920s. Peasant and Smallholder Parties, 94. The German Republic and the Spirit of Locarno. The keystone of Europe was Germany, which also had its revolution in 1918. But it was a revolution without revolutionaries. A negative revolution caused more by the disappearance of the old than by any decisive arrival of the new. The emperor and the high command of the army in the last weeks of the war had bowed out of the picture, leaving it to others to face defeat and humiliation. For a time after November 1918, the political leaders in charge of affairs were mainly Social Democrats. The Social Democrats were Marxists, but their Marxism was the tamed, toned down, and revisionist Marxism that had prevailed for 20 years before the advent of Lenin. They were trade union officials and party managers. They could look back in 1918 on decades spent in developing Labor's 796 organizations and building up the Social Democratic Party, which in 1912 had become the largest single party in the Reichstag. Now, in 1918, they were a cautious and prudent group, more anxious to preserve what they had already achieved than to launch audacious new social experiments. Before 1917, the Social Democrats considered themselves well to the left. But the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia and the emergence of a pro-Bolshevik or communist element in Germany put the Social Democrats in the middle. The middle is an awkward spot, especially in disturbed times. The communists regarded the Social Democrats as reactionaries, despicable traitors to the working class movement, whereas the true 1399 reactionaries, recruited from old monarchists, army officers, junker landowners, and big business groups, saw in social democracy, or professed to see in it, a dangerous flirtation with Bolshevism. The middle group in Germany, the Social Democrats reinforced by the Catholic Center Party and others, was more afraid of the left than of the right. They were appalled in 1918 and 1919 by the stories brought out of Russia, not merely by bourgeois and aristocratic exiles, but by refugee Social Democrats, Mensheviks, and anti-Leninist Bolsheviks, many of whom the socialists had long known and trusted in the Second International. In January 1919, the Spartacists, one led by Karl Liebknecht and Rosa Luxemburg, attempted to bring about a German proletarian revolution, like that in Russia. Lenin and the Russian Bolsheviks aided them. For a time, there seemed to be a possibility that the Spartacists might succeed in imposing a communist dictatorship of the proletariat in Germany. But the Social Democratic Provisional Government crushed the Spartacist uprising. turning for that purpose to demobilized army officers and volunteer vigilantes recruited from the disbanding army. The Spartacist leaders Liebknecht and Luxemburg were arrested and shot while in police custody. The events of Spartacus Week widened the chasm between Social Democrats and Communists. The Spartacists. Shortly after the suppression of the Spartacists, elections were held for a national constituent assembly. No single party received a majority, but the Social Democrats were the leading party. A coalition of Social Democrats, Center Party, and Liberal Democrats dominated the assembly. After several months of deliberations at the city of Weimar, in July 1919, a constitution was adopted establishing a democratic republic. The Weimar Republic, as the regime in Germany from 1919 to the advent of Hitler in 1933 is called, was soon threatened ominously from the right. In 1920, a group of disaffected army officers staged a putsch, or armed revolt, put the Republican government to flight, and attempted to place a puppet of their own, one Dr. Kapp, at the head of the state. The Berlin 1400 workers, by turning off public utilities, stopped the Kapp putsch and saved the Republic. But the Weimar government never took sufficiently firm measures to put down private armed bands led by reactionary or outspokenly anti-democratic agitators. One of these was soon to be Adolf Hitler, who as early as 1923 staged an abortive revolt in Munich. Being democratic and liberal, the Weimar government would not deny the rights of free speech or of election to the Reichstag to even the most radical anti-democratic groups on the left or the right. The Weimar Republic was in principle highly democratic. The Constitution embodied all the devices then favored by the most advanced Democrats, including universal suffrage, the vote for women, proportional representation, and procedures for referendums and petitions on public issues. But except for the legal 8-hour day and a few other such safeguards to the workers' welfare 797, the republic of which the Social Democrats were the main architects in its formative years was remote from anything socialist. No industries were nationalized. No property changed hands. No land laws or agrarian reforms were undertaken, as in the new states of Eastern Europe. The East Elbian Junkers remained untouched in their landed estates. The very statues of Germany's earlier emperors, kings, princes, and grand dukes were left standing in the streets and squares. Officials, civil servants, police agents, professors, and school teachers of old imperial Germany remained at their respective duties. The army, though limited by the Versailles Treaty to 100,000 men, remained the old army in miniature, with all its essential organization intact and lacking only in numbers. In the officer corps, the old professional and aristocratic influences remained strong. The Weimar Republic, 1401. The Spartacists in Germany tried to provoke a Soviet-style communist revolution in early 1919, but their uprising was suppressed by the Social Democratic Provisional Government. These people are burning political pamphlets that they had seized from Spartacist newspaper offices. Central Press Hulton Archive, Getty Images. Never had there been a revolution so mild, so reasonable, so tolerant. There was no terror, no fanaticism, no stirring faith, no expropriation, and no émigré migration. There had in truth been no revolution at all, in the sense in which England, France, the United States, Russia, and other countries either recently or in the more distant past had experienced revolutions. The German democracy and Versailles and Cairn. The supreme question for Europe and the world after 1920 was how Germany would adjust to the post-war conditions. How would the Germans accept the new internal regime of democracy? How would they accept the new German frontiers and other provisions of the Treaty of Versailles? The two questions were unfortunately interconnected. The Weimar Republic and the Treaty of Versailles were both products of the defeat of Germany in the war. There were many Germans who favored democracy, notably the numerous Social Democrats, and many more possibly could have been won over to it given time and favorable conditions. But no one, not even the Social Democrats, accepted the Treaty of Versailles or the new German frontiers as either just or final. If democracy in Germany meant the perpetual acceptance of the Treaty 1402 without amendment, or if it meant economic distress or hardship that could either reasonably or unreasonably be explained as consequences of the treaty, then democracy would lose such appeal as it had for the Germans. The German Republicans, as we have seen, protested against the Versailles Treaty before signing, and signed only under pressure. The Allies' 798 continued the wartime naval blockade after the armistice, thus confirming, in German eyes, the argument that the Treaty of Versailles was a diktat, a vengeful, dictated peace. The war guilt clause may have satisfied a deeply felt Anglo-American sense of morality, but it offended the strong belief in national honor that most Germans continued to affirm after 1919. Neither the reparations demanded of them nor the new frontiers were accepted by the Germans as settled. They regarded reparations as a perpetual mortgage on their future, and they generally expected someday to revise their eastern frontier, recover at least the Polish corridor, and merge with German-speaking Austria. The Versailles Treaty as diktat. The French lived in fear of the day when Germany would recover. Their plans for their own security and for the collective security of Europe against a German revival had been disappointed. They had been unable to detach the Rhineland from Germany. The United States Senate had refused to ratify the treaty that Wilson signed at Paris, by which the United States was to support France against any future German invasion. Both Britain and the United States showed a tendency to isolation, to pull away from the continent, to get back to normalcy, to work mainly for a restored trade in which a prosperous Germany would be a large customer. The League of Nations, of which the United States was not a member and in which every member nation had a veto, offered little assurance of safety to the French. The French began to form alliances against a potentially resurgent Germany with Poland, Czechoslovakia, and other Eastern European states. They insisted also on German payment of reparations. 1403. The amount of reparations left unstated in the treaty was fixed by a reparations commission in 1921 at 132 billion gold marks, the equivalent at the time of $35 billion, a sum that even non-German economists said was more than Germany could possibly pay. French fear. The Weimar government in these circumstances looked to the Soviet Union, which had been no party to the Versailles Treaty, and claimed no reparations. The Soviet government, meanwhile, concluding from the failure of proletarian revolution in Germany and Hungary that the time was not ripe for the Sovietizing of Europe, prepared to enter into normal diplomatic relations with established governments. Germany and the Soviet Union, despite ideological repugnance, thus signed the Treaty of Rapallo in 1922. In the following years, the Soviet Union obtained needed manufactures from Germany, and German factories and workers were kept busy by orders from the Soviets. The German army dispatched officers and technicians to give instruction to the Red Army. Obliged by the Treaty of Versailles to restrict its activities, the German army was in fact able, through its work in Russia and through a number of subterfuges at home, to maintain a high standard of training and technical knowledge of new weapons and equipment. Soviet-German relations. Reparations, the German inflation of 1923, recovery. The French, blocked in the attempt to collect reparations and assisted by the Belgians, in 1923 sent units of the French army to occupy the industrial sites of the Ruhr Valley. The Germans responded by general strikes and passive resistance. To sustain the workers, the Weimar government paid them benefits by grinding new paper money off the printing presses. Germany, like other belligerent countries, had suffered 404 from inflation during and after the war. Neither the imperial nor the Weimar government had been willing to impose heavier taxes to offset it. But what now swept Germany was different from ordinary inflation. It was of catastrophic and utterly ruinous proportions. Paper money became literally worthless. By the end of 1923, it took over 4 trillion paper marks to equal $1, 799. This inflation brought far more of a social revolution than the fall of the Hohenzollern Empire had ever done. Debtors paid off debts in worthless money. Creditors received baskets full of meaningless paper. Salaries, even when raised, lagged behind the soaring cost of living. Annuities, pensions, proceeds of insurance policies, savings accounts in the banks, income from bonds and mortgages, every form of revenue that had been arranged for in the past, and which often represented the economy, foresight, and personal planning of many years, now turned to nothing. The middle class was pauperized and demoralized. Middle class people were now materially in much the same position as workers and proletarians. Their whole view of life, however, made it impossible for them to identify themselves with the laboring class or to accept its socialist ideologies. They had lost faith in society itself, in the future, in the old burgher codes of self-reliance and rational planning of their own lives in an understandable world. A kind of moral void was created, with nothing for them to believe in, hope for, or respect. A social revolution. The inflation, however, by wiping out all outstanding indebtedness within the country, made it possible, once the losses were written off and accepted, to start up economic production afresh. The United States was persuaded to play a reluctant role, in part because it was demanding the payment of huge war debts by the Allies. The Allies, Britain, France, Belgium, insisted that they could not pay these debts to the United States unless they collected reparations from Germany. In 1924, the Dawes Plan, named for the American Charles G. Dawes, who negotiated the 1405 Agreement, provided Germany with a new means to ensure the flow of reparations. By the Dawes Plan, the French evacuated the Ruhr, the reparations payments were cut down, and arrangements were made for the German Republic to borrow abroad. A good deal of American private capital was invested in Germany in the following years, both in German government bonds and in German industrial enterprises. Gradually, so at least it seemed, Germany was put on its feet. For 4 or 5 years, the Weimar Republic even enjoyed a bustling prosperity, and there was new construction in roads, housing, factories, and ocean liners. But the prosperity rested in good measure on foreign loans. And the Great Depression that began in 1929 reopened all the old questions. The Dawes Plan. The spirit of Locarno. These years of economic prosperity were years also of relative international calm, yet none of the fundamental international issues were addressed or resolved. The universal German hatred for the Treaty of Versailles elicited no concessions from the Allies. Conceivably, had the Allies been willing at this time to amend the treaty by international agreement, they might have taken the wind from the sails of nationalistic rabble-rousers in Germany and so spared themselves much later grief. It may be, however, that no possible concession would have sufficed. The great problem was to prevent a German overthrow of the treaty structure by violence, especially in Eastern Europe, where the Germans regarded the new frontiers as very much subject to revision. After the Ruhr incident in 1923 and adoption of the Dawes Plan in 1924, a group of moderate and peace-loving national leaders shaped the foreign policy of the principal countries: Gustav Stresemann in Germany, Edouard Herriot and Aristide Briand in France, and Ramsay MacDonald in England. The Charter of the League of Nations provided for international sanctions against potential aggressors. Like the system of congresses after the Peace of Vienna, the League was designed to assure compliance with 1406, the peace treaties, or at the very least their 800 modification without resort to force. No one expected the League, by any authority of its own, to prevent war between great powers. But the League achieved various minor pacifications in the 1920s, and in any case, its headquarters at Geneva offered a convenient meeting place in which statesmen could talk. The catastrophic German inflation of 1903 destroyed the value of wages, savings, and investments. Consumers held millions of worthless marks and struggled to buy even the most essential goods. This woman used her paper money to light a fire in her kitchen stove. Historical, Corbis Historical, Getty Images. As a further assurance against war, in 1925, the European powers signed a number of treaties at Locarno, Switzerland. These marked the highest point in international goodwill reached between the two world wars. Germany signed a treaty with France and Belgium, guaranteeing their respective frontiers unconditionally. It signed arbitration treaties with Poland and Czechoslovakia, not guaranteeing these frontiers as they stood, but undertaking to attempt changes in them only by internationals, 1407 discussion, agreement, or arbitration. France signed treaties with Poland and Czechoslovakia promising military aid if they were attacked by Germany. France thus fortified its policy of balancing German power in the East by its own diplomatic alliances and by supporting the Little Entente. as the Alliance of Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, and Romania was called. Great Britain guaranteed, that is, promised military aid in the event of violation, the frontiers of Belgium and France against Germany. It did not give an equivalent guarantee with respect to Czechoslovakia or Poland. It was on the borders of Czechoslovakia and Poland, 14 years later, that the Second World War began. Had Britain gone along with France in 1925 in guaranteeing these two countries, then abided by the guarantee, the Second World War might possibly have been prevented. On the other hand, no war ever depends on any single decision. It is the accumulation 801 of many decisions that matters, and the expansionist ambitions of Hitler and the German Nazis would not have disappeared in 1939 if the British had simply guaranteed the protection of eastern national borders in the 1920s. The Locarno Treaties, in 1925, people talked with relief of the spirit of Locarno. In 1928, international harmony was again strengthened when the French Foreign Minister Briand and the United States Secretary of State Frank B. Kellogg arranged for the Pact of Paris. Ultimately signed by 65 nations, it condemned recourse to war for the solution of international controversies, though it provided no measures of enforcement. In the mid-1920s, the outlook for European international relations was therefore full of hope. At Locarno, Germany had of its own volition accepted its borders both east and west, to the extent of abjuring violence and unilateral action even in the east. In 1926, Germany joined the League of Nations. Germany appeared to be developing a democratic republic. Democracy also seemed to work, as well as could be expected. In 1408, most of the new states of Eastern Europe, and Communist Russia itself, had halted its post-war revolutionary offensive. The world economy was again expanding, and the major European nations seemed to be more prosperous. World production was at or above the pre-war level. World trade, by 1929, measured in hard money, gold, had almost doubled since 1913. The war and the post-war troubles were remembered as a nightmare from which Europe had finally escaped. It seemed that, after all, the world had been made safe for democracy. A hopeful outlook. But complacency was shattered by the Great World Depression, by the growth of a malignant nationalism in Germany, due in part to the Depression, and by the assertion of a new militancy in Japan, which also gained influence during the Depression. But let us turn first to the post-war Asian nationalisms that rose up against European imperialism and challenged Europe's once dominant position in the global economy.